Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is the second episode of my Redstone Commands series. In this episode I want to cover command blocks which play the link between Redstone circuitry and Minecraft commands. I will start with some general information about the block itself, then I will go into detail of how it works, and then finally I will give you a few rather common examples or useful examples of what you can actually do with that. And that should be enough for prologue, so let's get straight to this episode. First things first, how can you actually get a command block? Now, you will not find a command block lying around usually, and you won't find it in the creative menu anywhere. For example, in the Redstone components, it's not there. To get a command block, you need access to commands. Now, there are a few commands you can use. The likely simplest one is the GIF command, so you just start tipping with the GIF, and then, well, you usually would select yourself, and then you start typing command, and now you already have the four different options available to you. The normal command block, or impulse command block, then the chain command block, the repeating command block, and then the outlier, the command block Minecart, or Minecart with command block, which is the outlier here since it's not actually a block but an entity. Anyway, let's go with the normal command block. Select that one, press enter, and voila, you have it in your inventory. Well, if you have some space left there, at least. So that's one way. Another way is using the setBlock command for the three actual block types. Just give the locations and then select once more what type of command block you want to place. You can theoretically also use the fill command, although this usually doesn't make much sense. And for the minecart, since it's an entity, you need to use the summon command. An example for that I will show you a bit later. So that's how you can get them using commands. If you find a command block lying around and you are in creative mode, you can get the command block also on a different way, and that is using the middle mouse button. So use the middle mouse button, and obviously you get a copy of that block in your inventory. If you place that down, this is a fresh copy, no inserted command, nothing like that. If you use the control middle mouse button combination, you will copy it with the NPT data, which also includes, for example, the inserted command. So if you need to place a lot of command blocks that have the same or a very similar command in them, it's usually easier to use a carbon copy of the entire thing with the command and then just make the minor modifications. So that's the way you can get them. Also, by the way, if you have a impulse command block, for example, you can simply turn it into a chain command block using the UI, but I will talk about this a bit more a bit later. Next, let's talk about the physical attributes of command blocks. So essentially you can think of them as being crafted from bedrock. They are completely immovable, they have the same blast resistance as bedrock, which basically means you can't blow them up in any shape or form. Well, there are some options to supercharge an explosion, but nothing that will naturally appear in the game will destroy a command block. They also can't be mined outside of, well, the creative mode. And they are full blocks, so they will transmit redstone power. The major difference is that the command block is actually a directional block. You can see this type of arrow here, which is visible on four sides of the command block. The sides the arrows are aiming towards has the circle, and the opposing side has the square. The command block is always placed aiming towards the player who placed them, roughly at least. This is for the most part not really that interesting, but it plays a major role when we're talking about conditional execution of commands and chaining of command blocks. What this is, we will see a bit later in this episode. So that's basically the pure physical attributes of the block itself. Next up, let's talk about the interaction with Redstone circuitry. As I said before, the command block links Redstone circuitry with Minecraft commands. And this is actually a bidirectional connection. Not only can you trigger commands using redstone signals, but you can also get a feedback back that tells you whether the command was executed successfully, which you can also use to chain command blocks in a certain way. Anyway, let's talk about powering a command block. So you can power a command block directly or indirectly via a full block. This could, for example, also be another command block, by the way. Quasi-connectivity doesn't play a role when it comes to command blocks. Just on as a side note there. Also, this option here needs to be set to needs redstone if it is supposed to react to redstone signals on the outside. If it's always active, it simply ignores redstone circuitry and just takes into account the other options here. As a little side note there. Now let's talk about getting some feedback from the command block. Well, there are actually two ways to get the feedback. The comparator I will talk about in a moment. For now, let's talk about the observer. Observers detect when block data changes. So let's look at the block data. So we can see the phasing. Actually, let's look at the command block. So now, as you can see, we have a phasing. This is determined the moment you place it down, and this doesn't change in any way, shape, or form. What can change is the conditional, which is an option you can change in the UI. And also, as I have already shown you a bit in the beginning, you can change the type of command block, which is actually a different block that gets placed and will subsequently also trigger an observer. So let me quickly show you this. So I changed the conditional setting. You can see the observer triggers. And similarly, if I change the command block type, it also triggers. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But this change is purely player driven, so you could use this, for example, to determine if someone is playing around with your command blocks in certain ways, but it's not really that interesting for instance circuitry. A bit more interesting is the comparator. So the comparator will read out the success count. When a command gets executed, it counts how many times that command was executed at this specific point in time. For most commands, this means you get either a 0 or a 1 signal strength out if you use a comparator. So as you can see, this is a simple command, and you get this command just executed once when you trigger the command block. So the success count when it gets triggered is, well, 1. To reset the success count, you can just double click here and now it's reset. And all I need is to power it again and it goes back again to 1. There are just a few commands that can be executed multiple times at the same moment or same trigger. For example, the execute command can be used to trigger a command for every player on the map, just as an example. And then the signal strength would be equal to the number of parallel executions. Well, at least up to 15, and well, 15 is the maximum signal strength. So that's for a command block. If we're talking about the command block Minecart, it works somewhat similar. To trigger that, you need to place it on top of a powered activator rail, and to read it out, you need a detector rail plus comparator combination. But the basic functionality is the same when you compare it to normal command blocks. Following that, let's talk about the user interface of command blocks. So first of all, if you open the UI of a command block, the time stops in single player mode, similar to how it would work if you just opened the menu. Secondly, you can only open the UI if you are in creative mode and you have the required permission level. Now in single player, this is usually the case. In server multiplayer gameplay, this might not be the case. If you want to know more about this, I would recommend looking it up in the wiki. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get to the actual parts of the user interface. And here, let's start with the command line and the feedback line, or as they are officially named, the console command and the previous output. So what are they for? Well, the console command is the text field where you actually input the command you want to execute. In this case, I'm summoning a chicken, and well, let's do that, and voila, we have a chicken. And you can already see previous output tells me what was the previous output, which by the way is essentially the chat message you get for most commands that actually tells you what has happened in the background or what the command block has actually done. With just a minor difference here, it tells basically the name of the command block. And here instead, since we are already in a command block and know what command block we're talking about, it instead tells you when that command was executed. If you don't want that, you can deactivate this. This might be a good idea or good option if you have thousands of command blocks in your world and you want to reduce memory requirements or reduce some lag. But in normal cases, it doesn't make much of a difference either way. Some commands, for example, commands that directly output a chat message, won't give you a previous output, and in that case, this here will be left empty, basically. You can also reset it by, well, first deactivating it and then activating it, and yeah, now you can see it's completely empty since there is no message saved at the moment. But that's just as a little side note. Now, these chat messages here, let's actually get rid of that annoying chicken though. So these chat messages here, they can get quite annoying, especially if you have a repeating command block running over and over and just spamming your chat. If you want to avoid this, there is the game rule, command block output. And if you set this to false, what will happen is this chat message is no longer produced. It will still be basically put into the previous output. So this is not affected if you use the game rule here. And you can see this immediately reduces all of that noise of chat clutter. So that's the first thing. There are some commands a command block can't execute due to permission level. Those are generally commands that have to do with server management, banning, whitelisting, whatever. There is one more thing I want to mention here, and that is if you rename the command block using an anvil before you place it down, the new name gets actually displayed when the command gets executed. So in this case, the command block is just a simple message. And before I placed the command block, I renamed it to command block says. What, basically. So if you have some command blocks and they tell you, hello, I have a problem here, or something was triggered, and you rename the command block, that way you can maybe make it a bit easier to figure out what command block actually triggered. So just a little trick or tip there. The Minecart command block works the same, has also a console command and the previous output line. Next, we have the type of the command block. So we have an impulse command block, or the normal command block basically, a chain command block, and we have a repeating command block. They can all be, as I have already shown you before, turned one into the other by just using the first of those three buttons at the bottom here. The main difference in the functionality is the impulse command block gets executed once for every signal, redstone signal it receives. Then the chain command block is triggered by other command blocks. This is where the direction of the arrows comes into play. So this command block, when it executed or it gets triggered, would actually trigger this chain command block. And this chain command block would be able to potentially trigger a chain command block in this position here. So basically, the trigger is traveling along the path of the arrows. And the repeating command block executes over and over as long as it's, for example, powered or triggered. Then we have the conditional or unconditional. Now, this is pretty interesting. First of all, it's, as you have already seen, block data and is actually visible in the texture. So if you see this double arrow here, this means this block is set to conditional. If it's a simple arrow here, it's set to unconditional. This is independent of what type of command block you actually have. So you can see this also works, for example, with the impulse block there. What does this mean? Well, if the block is set to conditional, it checks the block behind it. And with behind it, I mean really behind it concerning the arrow on the block that makes the check. If the block behind the command block is also a command block and has a success count greater than 0, then the command block that makes that check, that is set to conditional, will also execute. If that check is not successful, because this has failed the last execution or is not a command block, then this command block here will not execute its command. It might trigger a following command block, or a following chain command block, but it will not itself trigger. Just keep that in mind. I will show you an example a bit later. And lastly, the difference between needs redstone and always active. It's pretty simple or pretty straightforward, but well, needs redstone means it executes the command only for as long as it's powered. Oh, damn it, chicken use the teleporter command there. Let's move that again. So, as I was saying, the needs redstone means the command block needs redstone signals to actually be able to trigger. The always active means it doesn't need redstone circuitry or redstone signals. It simply ignores the redstone signals from the outside and simply does its thing. This is generally only really used with the repeating and the chain command blocks. So, anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about the command execution actually. So, let's go through how the three different types work in more detail. The impulse command block has a simple command, and if it's set to needs redstone, which is usually the case, then it triggers one game tick after it is powered. So you have a 20th second of delay between the whole system here getting powered and the command actually being executed. This is something you should keep in mind. So that was simple. Let's talk about the chain command block. This gets a bit more interesting. So I have built this structure here to show you a few things. First of all, how is the structure made? So I have a command A here, B here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, just so that you can identify what is going on here. So let's start by activating A. So you can see I get A, obviously, and then I get 3 and 6. So by the way, A and let's get rid of that one. A and B I need since I wouldn't be able to actually trigger the chain command block with just redstone circuitry. A chain command block needs to be triggered with a command block. So I need a impulse command block to actually trigger the chain. So with that out of the way, let's talk about this chain here again. So obviously A triggers. Why does 1 not trigger? Well, because there is not a command block below it. So subsequently, it will not trigger. 2 doesn't trigger because 1 also didn't trigger and has not saved a successful command execution. 3 triggers because it's not conditional. 4 also triggers because it's, well, 4 doesn't actually trigger because it's set to needs redstone. So you can actually stop the execution of a single command without breaking the chaining. This is what I wanted to show you here. So needs redstone doesn't stop the chaining. So anyway, let's go back. So 3 triggered, 4 doesn't trigger because it needs redstone, 5 doesn't trigger because this one here has no success saved, and then 6 triggers because, well, it get triggered and it is always active. And if I now activate this, you can see now the 4 got also activated, but besides of that, nothing really changed. Now let's trigger B. So what happens? B triggers. The conditional 5 also triggers because this one here now has a success. And then 6 triggers again. And now for the final bit, let's trigger A again. And now you can see he also get 5 triggered because the impulse block here still has the success memorized. And this will be memorized until, well, either this gets triggered and can execute for some reason, or I manually reset the success count. As you can see, 5 no longer triggers now. So that's in a nutshell how the chaining works. Also what you can see here, since a command block triggers the command or the chain command block it's directed towards, you can fuse chains, which I did in this point here, but you can't split chains. Redstone or needs redstone doesn't stop chaining. I already showed you, no additional delay. Yep, this is also important. The entire chain here is executed in the same game tick. It's still executed in order. So the command here would be executed first, then the command here, then here, then here, and so on. This is very similar to what you would get when you have a situation like this here. So if this command executes and is successful, then the comparator would turn on and would trigger this comparator, this command block here. The downside of that is, for one, if you don't reset it properly, the chain will break. And for the other, you get a 1 tick delay in here. And it's also bigger on the entire thing in total because you need the space for the comparator. So this here is an instantaneous version of this type of chaining there. And also much more versatile because, as you can see here, it can go around corners. So that's the chaining. Now let's talk about the repeating command block. The repeating command block, when it gets triggered, has an initial delay of 1 game tick, and then it will execute every game tick, so 20 times a second. So if I trigger it for 1 second, in this case it simply gives me some iron blocks. You can see it triggers for 1 second, so 20 game ticks, and subsequently gives me 20 iron blocks in this case. And that's the entire story in a nutshell. Obviously, if I set it to always active, it will run and run and run until, for example, if I have it in conditional, for example, and the command block below it stops or has a error. So that's the command blocks. Now let's quickly talk about the minecart with command block. So let me quickly summon one in with already a filled-in command. And what you can see here is there are some commands that don't actually get executed because it has a command, but apparently it has some issues with chat messages. But if I were to use, let's say, a set block command, and then let's go 2 up, and then an iron block, and now you can see it starts placing those iron blocks. Now, the command block minecart may appear to be an impulse command block, but it's actually closer to the repeating command block because it triggers every 4 game ticks, so 5 times a second, when it's on top of a powered activator rail. That's the whole story for this one here. And with that, we actually come to the different examples already. So let's start with the example for the command minecart. Now, I have never used command minecarts in any of my, well, builds obviously, but also in any of my worlds. But there was one example in the wiki that I found rather interesting, and this here is a slight modification of that. And that is a dispenser minecart. Well, at least something that appears to be a dispenser minecart, because what I'm summoning in here is actually a command block minecart. So how does this work? Well, the command block minecart has something that is called custom display tile. That is basically a description of what type of block is rendered on the inside of the minecart. And in this case, this was replaced with the dispenser. So the default value is the impulse command block, and here I replaced this with a dispenser in a certain orientation. Moved slightly upwards so it looks somewhat nice, and then I have input a command, and this command is, well, it summons in an egg, so a thrown egg that is thrown in a certain direction. And that's already the entire story in a nutshell. So very interesting, and might be something you might find interesting for an adventure map. Well, obviously not with X, but with arrows. I can think of quite a few uses for that. But I'm digressing. So let's continue with the 4 most common uses for command blocks in my worlds. The first I want to mention here is debris cleanup. So what is a debris cleaner used for? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So when I'm building or designing my big vault doors, I have quite commonly a situation where I have blocks with redstone attached, and I need to remove that block for some reason. And I'm too lazy, or I can't reach the redstone circuitry, and that ends up with items lying all over the place, or if I'm really unlucky, getting sucked into some hoppers, which plays havoc on the involved timings, and then if I don't notice it, stuff breaks. So that's really annoying and can involve having to rebuild more than I was considering in the beginning. So to avoid that, when I build my or design my big doors, I usually set up a debris cleaner. What is that? Well, it's a repeating command block set to needs redstone, and in there is a kill command set to only killing items in a certain distance. Now, this distance here is very small, but generally I set this to a distance that involves the entire build. So what does this do? Well, if an item gets close enough to the command block, it simply gets removed from the game. And that's already the entire system. I set it to needs redstone so I can easily deactivate it without having to remove the block or playing around with the block. So this is pretty comfortable and quite common use when I'm designing stuff. Next up is the teleporter, which I have also in this world in some locations already, but you can also find this quite common in my tutorial world. And this is just a simple teleport command for the nearest player. So in this case, it teleports me 20 meters up, which doesn't make much sense, besides of a death trap. So as you can see, it doesn't make much of a difference there. Well, it teleports you to wherever you need to go. Quite commonly used in my worlds when I have a fixed connection between 2 points and there's a bit of a distance between them. Or I want to connect 2 specific points with each other. Then let's talk about this one down here. So this is the set block command in a repeating command block. This can be used in 2 ways, or I use this quite commonly in 2 ways. The first is replacing a block in a line of blocks that's been pushed in a certain direction. This is when I want to test, for example, a storage system and I need to move blocks into the storage system in a certain frequency. The command here is essentially a set block command. I'm just checking in the beginning that there is actually air where I want to place the block, so I'm not accidentally replacing a piston arm with a block which would break the piston if you're not careful. The other option is, well, removing blocks by simply placing air in a certain position. This is obviously when I'm testing something like a block generator and don't want to deal with the overflowing blocks at some point. So pretty straightforward and quite useful if you're testing stuff. And the last is if you are a bit lazy or you don't want a lot of wire spaghetti in your world, you can use remote button and levers. So how does this work? Well, I have those 2 command blocks. The first sets a redstone block in a certain location, and the second sets or puts a air block at the same location, so we'll remove the redstone block again. In this case, it's directly above the piston here, and as you can see, since those are connected via the block and the torch here, I have now essentially a lever that works remotely. There's a bit of an additional delay with the removal, so the setting of the block is instantaneous, the removal has a 1 tick delay, so this one here would be a 1.1 second button essentially. Pretty straightforward and can be quite useful. I use this quite often if I don't want to deal with well, spaghetti, or if I need to activate several systems at the same time in far distant areas and I don't want to worry about the circuitry in between. Since you can also simply chain those together with a chain command block then there and subsequently make more than just 1 pair. And with that, we have reached the end of this episode about command blocks. I hope you enjoyed this little episode and, well, see ya!